Bienvenidas a todos y a todos a este conversatorio virtual en vivo con las personas.
Welcome, everyone, to this virtual and live discussion with the candidates for commissioners and commissioners of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We'd like to thank the candidates for joining us this afternoon. We are extremely grateful for your time and your willingness to participate in this event. We'd also like to thank those who are following the event on different platforms and from different parts of the Americas. For those of you who are on Zoom, we'd like to remind you that you can activate the Spanish, English, or Portuguese simultaneous translation option. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find an icon to enable the translation to the language you need. We'd like to remind you that we're also transmitting on Facebook Live and YouTube of the organizations. This event is organized by CEJIL, the Foundation for Due Process, or DPLF, IFEX-ALC, Redlad, and the Rule of Law Program for Latin America of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, Open Society Justice Initiative, and Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. All of these organizations have been sharing the purpose of supporting the initiatives around the protection of human rights. One fundamental way in which we believe that we can carry out this commitment is by looking for possible ways to apply some of the principles and values that we promote, such as transparency, participation, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to the process of electing people in leadership positions in our human rights system, i.e. commissioners. So we believe that the human rights agencies are interconnected, and the logical consequence is that the weakening of the entity leads to dangerous problems in the system, and strengthening their process and standards can lead to positive changes elsewhere. That is why the principles that our systems are based on will have an impact not only on our region, but throughout the world. We are at a key moment for this system, before the election of 3 commissioners and 4 judges, along with a moment that poses several challenges for the protection and promotion of human rights. The need to establish a discussion with those who lead our institutions is of increasingly greater importance. And obviously, if we wish to continue strengthening the system, we must elect the right people for these positions. We see this as a small but important contribution to providing greater visibility and engaging more stakeholders in the process. We hope that this effort will be a genuine contribution to choosing the best people to lead a vital human rights institution. As we know, for many, the IACHR is, in many cases, the only hope that victims of human rights violations in our region will have. Finally, I cannot fail to mention that it is truly refreshing seeing a majority of female candidates among the finalists. We hope that that is a sign that our region is moving towards greater gender equality and that it ensures equity among our institutions. So how will this conversation be organized? First, we'll have 4 rounds of questions, each with a moderator. And for that, the moderator will ask a question from a series of topics that we shared in advance with the candidates, and each one of them has 4 minutes to answer. In each round, the order in which they will answer will change so that everybody has a different turn to respond. The 4th round will consist of 2 questions posed by the audience through the Zoom platform. When it's 30 seconds before they run out of time, they'll hear a sound, and after 4 minutes, the microphone will be muted. We'd like to remind you that there is translation available. So we ask the panelists to kindly maintain a good speed and modulation to make the work of interpreters easier. Let's now ask question number 1, which will be moderated by our colleague, Liliana Gamboa from the Open Society. Thank you very much, Alejandro. It's a pleasure to greet you all. And again, I'd like to thank you for your participation this afternoon. For this round, the order of the presentation is expected to be as follows. First, Mr. Carlos Bernal Pulido. Number 2, Ms. Roberta Clark. Number 3, Mr. Joel Hernandez. Number 4, Alexandra Huneos. And 5th, Ms. Antonia Urejola. Having said that, you have 4 minutes, and there will be a stopwatch so that you can monitor your own time. So I'll proceed to ask the question. During the presentations to the OAS Permanent Council held on September 22nd, the candidates, raised a series of priority issues for the region. Among the main challenges mentioned are poverty and social economic inequality, the effects on democratic institutions, the pandemic, and the current need for universal access to vaccination, climate change, the protection of vulnerable groups such as women, people of African descent, people from indigenous communities, among others. There's no doubt that these are some of the main challenges for the region, and therefore should be the priorities for the IACHR. And therefore, we'd like to ask you, how do you think the IACHR should address these types of challenges, some of which are already longstanding, and to which new ones are being added in such a way that you can have an impact both in the short and long term? What tools do you think you should use, and in what way could this be achieved, taking into account the limitations of human resources and financial resources that we are aware of? Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with such a good discussion, and so that we can participate, especially because the questions are really of a pressing nature. The first question has to do with the structural problems that were mentioned, such as poverty, inequality, climate change, and others. These structural problems represent very complex problems which involve institutional change, and there is no easy remedy for them. So I'll break this down into 2 questions. The first is, how do you believe that IACHR should approach this? Well, I believe there should be a change of focus, a change of perspective in terms of states. I mean, there's a bilateral approach between the Commission and the state, and the other approach is when there is a controversy and we have opponents, and also a perspective that tries to balance out these problems and offset them. So I think that this perspective, this approach, is effective to solve these structural problems. And what we need is a regional perspective that goes beyond the states, and that's structured in a preventative and permanent way. In that sense, I believe that IACHR should be a permanent forum for a discussion to foster dialogue between the organizations of civil society and the business organizations, as well as the interstate regional movement across states. And that should also involve multiple levels, such as banks, such as the Inter-American Development Bank, or institutions such as the Mercosur and cooperation agencies, which have the capacity to contribute resources. We know that IACHR has political competencies to be a catalyst of public policies and preventative policies, and also to implement technical assistance for these public policies. And with that, I'd like to move on to question number 2, which refers to the tools that should be implemented. And in this case, I would like to mention 3 specific strategies. The first is to strengthen the Executive Secretariat of Monitoring, which is less strong than the others right now. And that is the secretariat that could help us be the catalysts for this development of stronger public policies. And second, to strengthen the technical component, especially from 2 main pillars. For one, a cross-disciplinary aspect. We should not only deal with attorneys that write reports, and also our multimedia strategy that I also mentioned to you before. And lastly, I'd like to mention that the IACHR should become a catalyst to be a protagonist of change, structural change, and it's no secret to anyone that that happens. Well, your time's up. Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to Ms. Roberta Clark.
Thank you very much. And I join Carlos in thanking the organizers for engaging us in this dialogue. And I also say good afternoon to my fellow candidates. I must start off by acknowledging, as I always do, that our region, whether we're in North America, Central America, Latin America, or the Caribbean, our region is scarred by its history. Structural discrimination and poverty are prevalent and interconnected. And these conditions of deprivation make marginalized populations differentially exposed to the impacts of climate change, insecurity, and now the pandemic. In addition, the rise of authoritarian populism undermines democratic institutions and human rights culture. I think that there can be no solutions without the participation of peoples most affected by these conditions in the analysis of causes as well as in the formulation of responses. And I start there to say that the Commission must continue to ensure channels of interaction with a diversity of human rights. It can be alerted to emergent violations, which should trigger its early warning processes, and we'll talk about that. And it can activate dialogue with member states bilaterally and through the regional political system, and of course, dialogue between member states and human rights defenders. The Commission's functioning is dependent on the kinds of human rights violations under consideration. I think in this question, we're not talking so much about individual complaints and the filing of petitions, but rather the question focuses more is dependent on political will at the national level, evidenced through democratic pathways for participation, the allocation of resources, existence of enabling legislation, and so on. While these measures are taken at the national level, the Commission has some critical tools to promote human rights. And I want to acknowledge that the Commission has been doing that and doing that quite well for quite a while. But some key ones in relation to the tools in its toolkit. The investigation and documentation, I think, are key tools which have to be used expansively to highlight trends and experiences of human rights challenges and to make recommendations. The Commission's library of reports is really impressive. The reports are cited and used in advocacy and activism, and also shape technical advisory services at the level of member state. I think, though, these reports, while circulated sometimes through press releases, have to be given a wider dissemination. And given the digital divide in the region, which is related to inequality, the Commission must find ways of getting its message out to the most marginalized communities. And we have to think about how we do that. As an advocate, the Commission must articulate a consistent approach to reparative justice to improve the quality of life of the discriminated and marginalized groupings. In the context of COVID, the Commission should be in dialogue with key financial institutions to advocate for fiscal space for states to meet social expenditure. The Commission, of course, has a big convening role, and I've spoken about that, and brings states together with human rights defenders. And I think that's really quite central. And of course, the technical advisory role. The action is at national level, and so the Commission must be working with state actors to build their capacity to ensure rule of law and human rights-based programming and policy. Whilst the virtual world offers some opportunities for cost cutting, I think that we're going to have to be very mindful again of that digital divide, and how do we ensure access of the most affected communities to the Commission. And finally, a lot of this is dependent on resources. The Commission has to, with the Secretariat as its own advocate, to call on adequate resourcing to ensure that it meets its mandate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Clark. Then, corto, le paso la palabra al Dr. Hernández.
Gracias, doctora.
I'll give the floor to Joel Hernandez. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Gamboa. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizations that are participating in this event. And I'd also like to greet our colleagues, Alejandra, Antonia, Roberta, and Carlos. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. And I sincerely hope that very soon we'll be able to meet in person. Since the American Commission on Human Rights to identify these challenges, and to me, the key word is impact. Impact in the short and medium term. And this is the biggest challenge faced by the Commission. It needs to be an international organization for human rights with a transformational impact on society through complementary measures that strengthen the institutional frameworks around the protection and guarantee of human rights, and therefore which measures have to be implemented and how. These are the questions that IACHR is asking itself and has to continually ask itself to continue to face new challenges. I believe that the Commission has to continue to face challenges in two different ways. On the one hand, through preventative actions that allow us to create actions around the human rights in a country or a region. And the other equally important approach is to continue to meet the challenges. First, to be able to provide recovery to the victims of violations of human rights, and secondly, to remediate structural situations such as non-review measures as part of this repair, this recovery. And it's through the court that we're able to advance and to come closer to international standards that may prevail across the continent. But for the Commission to be effective, it has to develop both of the pillars in a strategic and complementary way, considering the available resources and the international nature of human rights. And some elements to understand these challenges include 5 aspects. And the next strategic plan around the most urgent themes related to human rights. Secondly, the adequate selection of a tool to solve a certain situation. IACHR, when it proposes a work visit by a rapporteur, or when it's best to resort to other mechanisms, that has to be analyzed. And thirdly, we have to identify strategic allies that share our concerns in terms of human rights, and the human rights institutions and the UN bodies. And fourth, to record the facts in the best possible manner. And it's very important to have a dialogue with all of the players involved that will make the Commission be a bridge for the solutions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez.
I also want to begin by thanking the 6 organizing
And-
institutions and saluting my fellow candidates and all the people throughout the Americas that are joining us today as part of this important process. As commissioner, I would make sure that the commission uses its discretion to uphold the rights of the most vulnerable people in the Americas and to defend democratic institutions as a condition for the enjoyment of human rights. The question posed asks us in essence, well, how would you make this emphasis succeed, right? How can the commission have the most actual impact in light of its many working tools and in light of its constraints? My answer is that the path to having impact relies on 2 components. First, the commission works best precisely when it makes a concerted effort to advance the ball in particular issue areas of concern. The Inter-American Commission is unique among international human rights institutions because no other organ has available to it as many different working methods. It has its promotion and monitoring work, its petition and cases systems, and within each of those categories, it has multifold mechanisms and modes of work. So that means that it can interact with different sets of interlocutors at the national and regional level. And engage with human rights in many different ways. And because of this, the Commission has tremendous potential for impact, but there's also a risk that the Commission can become too dispersed and therefore not effective in any particular realm. History shows that the Inter-American system works best when, as in the case of its work on femicide, on indigenous people's rights to their traditional territories, as in the cases of forced disappearance, the Commission works best when it prioritizes a certain human rights problem and the work of its different units follow it. So the work of its different units contribute to raising awareness of the problem, to rendering justice to the victim, to catalyzing structural change, and contributing to the development of human rights corpus juris in certain areas. Therefore, as commissioner, I would push to realize this view of a commission whose different units and methods are not in a zero-sum competition for resources, but rather work synchronously to promote and defend human rights with an explicit emphasis on the most vulnerable people of the Americas and on democratic institutions as a precondition for enjoying human rights. Second, the Inter-American system works best when it moves in partnership with civil society and other stakeholders and when it complements social movements on the ground. The defense of human rights in the Americas takes place within an ecosystem of different actors and different institutions, of which the Commission is a very important piece, but it's only a piece. So the second component of an impactful commission is to work productively with other stakeholders and audiences that are able to amplify the Commission's resolutions and opinions and interventions. So stakeholders on the ground are able to make the Commission's interventions resound. They're best situated to spot the truly urgent problems as they emerge and to understand how to overcome local obstacles to implementation of orders and recommendations. So what does this look like? It means that the Commission should listen to what social movements need in order to advance human rights, and it should think strategically about how best to complement and not compete or overlap with other stakeholders in the system. In other words, the Commission should lead, but it should also follow. A strong Commission will respond to and work in partnership with civil society and social movements and other actors on the ground in defense of human rights.
Muchas gracias, se acabó su tiempo. Pasamos ahora a la última intervención de la doctora Urrejola.
Thank you very much. Your time is up. We will now move to the last intervention. Thank you very much for this initiative, and I greet the other members of the panel. The first thing that seems indispensable for me is that the Plan 1721 is assessed so that a discussion can be made for the making of the next strategic plan with specific priorities, which without a doubt will coincide with the points made. The Commission has three pillars that are intercomplementary, which are monitoring and technical cooperation. In these three pillars, it should strengthen its presence in the democratic crises in the region. First, regarding the documentation of human rights, for instance, what has been going on in Nicaragua over the past 4 years, and mitigating the consequences of these human rights, assuring reparation to the victims, which is fundamental, and also cautionary measures, and above all, to strengthen the democracy in states so that the responses can be consistent with defense of human rights. The cooperation of the social, the civil organization, civil society organizations are crucial, and from this point of view, it seems to me that the discussion around fiscal policies of the states and their relevance for assuring human rights are very important. We have to work together and approach this. And thirdly, the pandemic also present other points like the transition towards new technologies and permanent work. We have to reassess the methods of work. Virtual visits, are they really useful in normal times? Also, the use of the internet in order to hold more virtual meetings. And this relates to the budget, which is a permanent challenge. And it is even more relevant during the pandemic. There is a commitment of the states of approaching this in a joint fashion. The commission was created by states within the OAS, and it must be strengthened, but one has to be realistic. The pandemic will affect all realms of civil society, not just human rights. We have to keep on demanding from states the commitment that is also reflected in funding, but also as a lesson learned from the pandemic. We have to think about costs, putting victims first. We have to consider the progress in the region and the effects on human rights, and how the Commission is working with states that do not comply with recommendations. Finally, I think that there is a need for creating a space of dialogue with members in a wide range of subjects, to create a common agenda, to have counseling, legislative counseling, and to talk with the different powers of the state or branches of the state. This is also essential, not just the executive, but the other branches too, and also to strengthen cooperation with the other human rights agencies in the Americas. The times that will come call for a commission that is strong and committed to human rights, that is resilient, adaptable, and can always be changing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Urrejola. We would like to thank all of you for your presentations. And with that, we move to question number 2. Thank you very much, Eliana. I would like to greet all of the candidates and also the people who are watching us through the different platforms. Thank you very much for being with us. The order of the presentation for the second round will be first Mr. Urrejola, and then Alejandra Truneos, followed by Mr. Joel Hernandez, and then Mrs. Clark, and finally Mr. Carlos Bernal Pulido. With the same dynamic, each of you will have a few minutes for the question that I will ask you. Over the past few years in the region, democratically elected governments that have been very popular have gradually taken up authoritarian trends, which in some cases have led to even more severe circumstances which have damaged the region. So with the different instances of the human rights system, the Commission is usually the first one to hear about these facts as they occur. So the Commission is like an early warning system in practice. We're talking here about things that range from judicial autonomy, freedom of expression, a right to contest, journalists and the representatives of political opposition, and so on. In this scenario, which is so complex and changing, how can the Commission improve or make its role more efficient? This role of early warning, and what mechanisms and tools should the Commission use and adjust in order to have a greater impact in the region and set out warnings about these threats and risks? Well, thank you very much. I would say that a commission that works in real time by granting importance to its role of defending the commission, the severe crisis in Ecuador and Bolivia, and also in Colombia. The commission has to be present in key areas, and it has to be a commission that responds to emergency situations with a strategic plan. It should refine its work in early warning, considering that there are crises in the region that are characterized by its long duration and constance. The main challenge of the next plan will be to reinforce the institutionality and mechanisms to respond to the new crises and challenges in this changing reality. First, we should stress the follow-up activities regarding human rights, replicating ad hoc mechanisms, as was the case of journalists in Ecuador and Colombia, and also in Mexico, the creation of Meceni, Nicaragua, and also in Bolivia. In times of crisis, it is important to adapt to circumstances. In the health crisis, we had the new restriction of the lack of possibility of traveling. And so we also need to resort to ad hoc mechanisms according to each case of crisis. Adaptability and flexibility in a context of challenge seems to be fundamental to me, while still abiding to the mandate. There's also challenges that every country faces, and so recommendations are a roadmap for states through the generation of methods of dialogue on specific topics in order to involve stakeholders in every country. Lastly, the support of training programs and counseling in legislative matters, etc. We have to strengthen the timely full response, and also facing specific crises in certain contexts. By these mechanisms, not only will we follow up these situations, but we will coordinate the mechanisms and strengthen the role of the Commission, strengthening a encompassing vision. We also have to establish a link with those who have a relationship with the system. And this seems to me fundamental to strengthen the relationship of the Commission with civil society. It has to be a space of hearing of all of the users in the system, but especially to the victims, to the silences that must be heard. I think that this is a fundamental role. It is not expressly in the mandate, but it is very relevant in these contexts. Thank you very much.
The Inter-American Commission
Dr. Hunes.
system has a deep experience with the breakdown of democratic regimes and with defending democratic actors. What's new today in the region, but also the world, is the slow hollowing out of constitutional democracy through piecemeal attacks, little by little and under the mantle of legality and constitutionalism. As one author writes, the new autocrats come to power not with bullets, but with laws. And they carefully preserve the shell of the prior liberal state, but in the meantime, hollow out its moral core. So in this context, in this new context, how can we make the Commission a more effective warning system and a better responder to these crises? I propose three approaches, three perspectives. First, the scholarship and the lived experience of the Commission tells us that the key lies with empowering domestic actors, social action and political mobilization is the most important way to counter democratic erosion. So that must be the Commission's role, to protect and amplify the voices of those who are defending democracy on the ground. And here, I do believe the Commission is doing a lot of things right. It responds to and amplifies warnings from civil society. It's creating a rich jurisprudence of protection of judges in the region when they're removed from the bench for political views. It's created a rapporteurship on human rights defenders and a rapporteurship that also focuses on journalists through the freedom of expression rapporteurships. And in these ways, it has been effective at detecting and defending against threats to democracy. It now can continue to deepen its relationship with these actors and perhaps expanding also to political parties, and continue and should deploy mechanisms such as the IACHR, but now focused on democratic crises as a way to import also the insight of interdisciplinary experts. It's better able to do all this in those countries that it has deeper relationships. And so part of the challenge here is to deepen its relationship with those countries such as the Caribbean, the United States, Canada, with which it doesn't have such a deep context right now. Second, the system has to create new standards that respond to the new threats. The tools developed by the Inter-American system in early years were meant to respond to overt anti-democratic maneuvers. And now we need new standards, new means of fighting for democracy. An example of this, I believe, is the recent advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court that basically tells us no more perpetual democracies. Enabling presidential re-election without term limits is contrary to the Declaration and American Convention. But it's not enough to oppose single measures like this. Often the problem lies not in a single measure, but a cluster of measures that seem on the face of it to be legal and compliant with inter-American human rights instruments. So here the Commission needs to draw on the rich scholarship on this to consider the complexity of assessing when an executive is endangering a constitutional democracy, and to educate itself and others on this complexity by holding hearings and through them developing a more sophisticated lens to detect and defend against the creep of autocratic legalism. And third, I'd like to emphasize in my time, where's my time screen? I can't find it. It's important to acknowledge that the early warning system is but a band-aid measure, and the hollowing out of democracy in our region is in response to some of the failings of governments and political systems to respond to corruption, illegal actors, and deep socioeconomic inequality and social exclusion. And in this way, part of the struggle isn't about early warning, but continuing to support the provision of socioeconomic rights, even in seemingly well-functioning democracies. And this is particularly so in the wake of the pandemic, which might otherwise cause more democracies to go down this path. I can't see my timer.
Muchas gracias. Adelante, doctor Hernández.
Muchas gracias, Leonor. Empiezo por señalar que efectivamente para la Comisión una de las más grandes preocupaciones que tiene en este momento.
I'll start by saying that for the Commission, one of the biggest concerns we have is the deterioration of democratic institutionality. We see with a lot of concern that the democratic spaces are being closed, and that is a huge concern because it makes it harder for us to promote human rights. And I think that identifying the early alert measures we must follow. Well, for one, the fact that IAHRS has to do better what it had already been doing. And secondly, as the question itself says, sometimes the Commission is the main agency that manifests itself within the OAS, and that is something that the Commission must continue to do in an objective and responsible manner, so that this is not restricted to the mandates, and especially when it comes to the American Convention. And I can't. The starting point must be the current strategic plan, an assessment of this strategic plan. We have to define what works so that we're able to build based on what has already been built. And my colleague identified that, but the candidates also, there are several areas related to that and the strategic plan. So this is about warning. And I would concentrate on two fundamental elements or two fundamental proposals, two proposals related to the capacities. I think it's important that the Commission is able to develop a communication policy. The Commission first needs to reach a better dissemination of all of the standards that it sets, but also theme reports and country level reports that are written as part of its mission. And under that policy, one must identify the messages that are going to be conveyed, as well as the target audience that these messages intend to achieve. And this involves a fundamental challenge of using an adequate language, for instance. And this would help improve this capacity that I called an early warning, as it were. And there's also a distribution of burdens among the several different sectors of the Secretariat. Now we have to create a task force for solving crises, a group of specialists dedicated to stepping ahead of the crises and giving timely speeches so that the Commission can have an impact that creates the required effect within the societies. Thank you very much. Now, I'll give the floor to Dr. Clark.
Thank you very much. I think we need to think about early warnings as both routine as well as extraordinary measures, and that is through the prisms of prevention as well as effective response. So the first thing, we cannot afford complacency. Our histories require vigilance in ensuring an understanding of and commitment to the rule of law and human rights. And in particular now, for example, in the context of the public health crisis, we are seeing in some instances questionable curtailment of rights. So we know we're really in a moment where we have to be thinking about how are we ahead of some of these trends. The Commission must be informed by analyses of governance and human rights trends so that it can take preventative action. Through its dialogue, as we've said over and over with member states, building the capacity of state actors, driving political will for compliance with obligations. And the Commission undertakes its own intellectual work, I know, but I think it should also be closely engaged with scholars, with academic institutions, and with human rights defenders to keep informed on the status of human rights so that through its functioning, the escalation of violations can be averted. And I think that that relates to the entire region, and in particular in the Caribbean as well. The Commission must continue to promote universalization, encourage states to establish their independent human rights institutions, and importantly, ensure unhindered access to the Commission, and particularly now in the context of COVID, where we have mobility restriction, how can we get over that as a way of ensuring that we have the best information and the best intelligence. In its protective mandate, it's carrying out early warnings quite routinely now, and I think in particular thinking about the precautionary measures, but also more recently established this rapid and integrated response coordination units, which I think one of the candidates has spoken about. I think that's really important and must be continued for more effective and timely understanding of emerging situations in the region. I think how human rights defenders are treated, restrictions on their actions, criminalization, crackdowns, is an early warning sign of gross and systematic violations, and the Commission has to be really on top of that. I think we should look to develop early warning indicators, for example, as is done under the Sustainable Development Goals 16, where there's an indicator on killing, kidnapping, enforced disappearances, etc., of journalists, trade unions, human rights advocates. But we also need early warning indicators on discrimination and for socioeconomic rights, as a deterioration in the enjoyment of these rights can lead to violence and social fragmentation and opens the way for illiberal forces and authoritarian populism. And so I think attention should be given to risk factors such as severe inequalities, lack of access to grievance mechanisms, lack of democratic space for active civil society, incursions into independence of the media, and rising unemployment. I think the economic factors are really quite critical in understanding what is happening in our region. So prevention requires both early warning and effective response. But we must also appreciate that in many cases, prevention fails not for lack of early warning, but for lack of early, effective, and rapid response. And that really is in the context of multilateralism, which the Commission must engage with to ensure that there is a trigger of a range of responses by the political actors, the member states, in response to the alerts raised by the Commission. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Doctor Bernal, adelante, por favor.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la oportunidad.
Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Dr. Bernal. Well, I had prepared a few slides, but will not follow my script here. Would like to comment on some of the answers that I just heard. I'd like to say that I do not agree with the perspective of the two current commissioners. And this opposing position between the Commission and the states. We must understand that the states and the state authorities are the hands of the system, and the Commission must constantly deliberate and give technical capacity to these states so that there is effective response to the problems, which may be transient crises or more permanent problems, as the professor mentioned. And secondly, I also do not agree with Commissioner Hernandez when it comes to emphasizing the communication strategy. As I mentioned before in my comments, I do not believe that a commission should be focused on governing based on interests. That can have big effects, but it's not effective. And we have to build capacity and provide technical assistance to the states to be able to solve in a timely manner all of the problems. In that sense, I want to propose that maybe the most important strategy. I would actually like to highlight two strategies. The first of which is the creation of something. Once we have structured the permanent problems, we should create permanent mechanisms to prevent violations where the civil society and the victims participate, as well as organizations from the member states themselves and the institutions that are related to human rights, such as the Court of Justice of the states, and the Commission can work in that regard, in that sense. It's the violations of fundamental rights and human rights. When the Commission hears about it, it should establish a connection with these networks to provide for a faster and more efficient response. And the second thing is that these networks should be disseminated across the territories. So we're talking about contexts in Latin America where it is not enough to send a warning over the Twitter to be read by the Ministry of Justice, but the local authorities should be in contact with the Commission, and these local authorities will in turn carry out their tasks in the field. And I say that because I think that the Commission can also work jointly with the civil organizations that have a greater territorial capacity to reach these more remote locations with endemic human rights problems that are easy to identify, and that we should be closer to preventatively to repair. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of the candidates for your answers that presented several different alternatives from different perspectives about how the Inter-American Commission can strengthen its mechanisms to generate early warnings. And now we move on to question number 3. That will be moderated by our colleague Francisco Quintana, specializing in international law. Thank you very much, Leonor. It's a pleasure to be at such an important event. I'd like to remind you the order of presentation for this round. Hernandez, Carlos Bernal, Roberto Clark, Antonio Rejola, and Alejandro Joneos. We have a central issue in the presentation to the Permanent Council, from the use of social networks to the preparation of its press releases, as well as various training and promotional activities that it carries out. It's a central issue for civil society that represents the victims in the face of the system. It is the response of the IACHR, both in the petition and case systems, which is a very valuable tool for the protection of rights, giving access to international justice to victims enshrined in the American Convention on Human Rights and other inter-American instruments. However, this field of work has a chronic problem of procedural delay in protecting the victims who exercise their rights. The current demands on both mechanisms are very high, but the need of victims and beneficiaries to receive timely and effective responses is urgent. Therefore, I want to ask a question that reflects one of the most recurring concerns of the states and victims. What are the 3 objectives that the Commission should establish to overcome the procedural delay and strengthen the scope of protection through precautionary measures and mechanisms? And what are some of the concrete actions the Commission should adopt in the next 4 years to achieve these goals? And now I'll give the floor to Dr. Joel Hernandez. Thank you very much. I would like to start by highlighting 2 fundamental aspects. First, I want to mention that it is by no means justified that 7 years are needed before a petition is catered to, and another 5 years till it gets to the report stage. And secondly, we have to start from a certain reality, and thanks to the Cancun agreements, the Commission was able to achieve many things. And there was a time when economic pressure on countries and organizations also had a repercussion. It's important for us to be realistic. there will not be major resources to hire additional personnel. So we have to do more with the same resources. And they have to be used responsibly and transparently. Having said that, I would like to mention 3 fundamental goals that must be implemented by the Commission. For one, I think we have to reach the goal that was not reached during this 5-year cycle, to conclude a petition. That is the first goal that should be taken on by the Commission for its next action plan. Secondly, the second goal, the Commission needs to concentrate its perspective on paradigm cases that will create social change through offering a solution to structural problems that deteriorate the conditions of the advocacy for human rights. And the third goal, in my opinion, is to be more efficient when reaching or implementing its decisions, not only those related to the fund reports, but also meeting the requirements of cautionary measures. And to reach these 3 goals, I believe that the Commission has to tread 2 different paths. For one, to continue to advance with the pre-approved measures to reduce this procedural delay. Currently, the initial time is 1 month, so it's decided whether the proceedings will be implemented or not. And so we have to advance in that path. And on the other hand, the Commission has to define mechanisms to select cases that are paradigms to us, so that progress can be achieved towards solving structural problems in member countries. And for that, we don't have to change any regulations. We must only establish the priorities, and these priorities should be made public and be systematized and be made available to all of the players involved. And lastly, the Commission needs to keep on working on its impact reservoir to reach out to a greater audience. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. And now I'd like to give the floor to Juan Carlos. Thank you very much. It's Carlos Bernal. About this subject, well, there's the following strategies. The first is to increase the efficacy of IACHR, and also because the Executive Secretariat cannot simply be a loose wheel that nobody can control, and that the evidences are not submitted to the scrutiny of the parties involved. These reports are shown on the webpage of the Commission. In between 2006 and 2020, between 30,120 petitions were received, and per year, 800,000 are received, and 800 are admitted per year. And the court complies with the deadlines for these petitions in up to 6 months individually. That is, the period seems to be insufficient, 5 years for each petition. Secondly, I would say that there should be a change of perspective within the IAHRS. it should not only verify that the parties have come to an agreement, it should also promote these agreements. You can see that between 2006 and 2020, out of 1,181 petitions admitted, only 125 came to a solution, an agreement. So I wonder if the Commission really undertook its best efforts to make this agreement to be reached. The third aspect involves the elaboration and implementation of protocols for selecting and prioritizing cases, considering penal and international law in context analysis and pilot cases. I also believe that the artificial intelligence strategies and tools can allow for the identification of situations around human rights at a regional level. So it's simply inconceivable that the Commission does not have these strategies to analyze context and strategy internationally. So here, these strategies will identify where the Commission can look for actions related to policies and human rights. And what's unacceptable is not only the matter of time as cautionary measures, but the implementation that takes 9 months by the state. And that's because the Commission does not involve the state in that process of adopting and implementing the cautionary measures in real time. The state needs to get involved. And once again, the Commission needs to work along with the state and be involved in providing protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Roberta Clark, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. So I cannot speak, I think, with authority on the initiatives to resolve the procedural backlog or indeed the follow-up to the Commission's recommendations. An opinion and recommendations should be based on an appreciation of how the Commission and the Secretariat are in fact working together. What is the division of labor? What is the staff composition? What are the workflow processes? I think I need to know a lot more about that. But drawing on the annual reports, certainly since the establishment of the strategic plan, the last strategic plan, it seems that efficiency, effectiveness, and legitimacy are the recurrent issues, with concerns for delay in the consideration of petitions. And these delays have led to backlogs at all stages of the process. And that delay, along with some non-compliance with the Commission's recommendations, are seen understandably as undermining the Commission's effectiveness and therefore legitimacy. Given the centrality of the petition system to the credibility of the Commission and, of course, to safeguarding lives and ensuring access to human rights, the sustained efforts to address delay are needed, not only to address the delay, but to monitor and support implementation of the precautionary measures and recommendations. From what I can gather, a number of significant improvements were taken in the last 3-4 years. One, strengthening the attention and accountability within the Secretariat and the commissioners, but also the establishment of this online platform, which speaks to the compliance with the recommendations and the precautionary measures. I think excellent. There's been some emphasis on the expansion of human resources, and I'm really happy to see some intention to stabilize the contracts of staff, because I think that's really critical in stabilizing the Secretariat and indeed the Commission. Streamline and targeted processes, reducing duplication. I think we've heard about that. Joining cases where there's an identity of parties or similar patterns. And then this adoption of resolutions on precautionary measures and friendly settlements that gives the Commission a more assertive role in its follow-up with member states. So this menu, this suite of improvements the annual report suggests has really led to some improvements, some noticeable impact, with a record number, they say, of petitions reviewed at the initial admissibility and merit stage. So if there's quantitative evidence that these adjustments are improving efficiencies, then I think we have to double down on that. But the review of the reform should also include a qualitative component to ensure that the expedited processes are not compromising access to the Commission, particularly by those most marginalized and without access to digitalization. And we also want to do some review of the quality of the reports being produced. Because the improvements in the Commission's processes and its successful digital presence and outreach, the numbers of petitions have been growing quite steadily. Between 1997, 435 to 2,448 in 2020, so exponential growth in that. The specter of backlog hovers over the Commission, and this requires a continued consideration on the scope of cases which the Commission will consider. I have some concrete actions. One, I do agree with the suggestion on the paradigm, the cases addressing structure. I think we need to increase the diversity of staff to promote more sub-regional specialization in the consideration of petitions as well as in outreach to member states. I think we need to review and assess the impact of the Commission's digital platform to enlarge the audience for strengthening human rights, culture and accountability. And I also think we need more expertise and specificity in the recommendations on laws and procedures to be adopted by states. I think we have to get to really to target member states in our recommendations to improve compliance and outreach on the degree of compliance. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra la doctora Antonia Urrejola.
Thank you very much. Dr. Antonia Urrejola has the floor. Thank you very much. Going back to the words of Commissioner Hernandez, it seems to me important to acknowledge the breakthroughs that have taken place since the 2017 strategic plan. For the first time from decades, the situation is changing and the measures have been yielding concrete results. There has been a considerable increase in the number of cases, and I think that the Commission has to continue on the path it has taken. Systematization of criteria, specialized work in order to have a more standardized work. And regarding sending out cases to courts, this is another challenge of the system following the recommendation, something Roberta Clark alluded to. They should be facilitators in the dialogue between parties, granting technical assistance, and major breakthroughs have been achieved, but it's in spite of these results and still having the current level of efficiency, the backlog will not disappear. Model systems should be used. Secondly, a use of human resources, and thirdly, strengthening the flow of analysis of documents in the Commission. The Commission cannot decide what cases to resolve and which ones not. We have to learn with the pandemic and resort to technological tools and update the data processing system. We have to consult the users of the system and the victims. Another challenge is to go on assuring the precautionary measures system. Several measures have been adopted, and the implementation of these measures are very important in times of crisis of human rights. I stress the importance of interinstitutional cooperation between states in order to implement measures. The importance of participation with a gender and minorities approach. We have to work with indigenous peoples and the precautionary measures have to be implemented. It also seems important to strengthen the skills of establishing debates and discussions. And lastly, in spite of the efforts for monitoring these measures, there are challenges. The Commission has tools in order to implement these precautionary measures, but more effort has to be made by visiting territories. Thank you. And finally, Alessandra Hornils.
First, the Commission should be able to respond to cases within the year and 3 to 4 years to final disposition of the cases. 2, eliminate the backlog, and 3, greater transparency and responsiveness on the precautionary measures. And I think those 3, I would love to see those 3 embedded in the next strategic report. I'd begin by saying 3 things about the backlog and delay. I believe that the twofold problem of slow processing of cases and managing this historical backlog is entirely manageable within the rules and within the resources currently before the Commission. This isn't the type of crisis facing, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, which had a backlog of 160,000 cases in 2012. In 2012, last year, the Commission received roughly 2,500 petitions. 80% of these were rejected. So the Commission is able, I believe, to handle 500 cases at the admissibility and merit stages. This is doable. Beyond that, carrying the backlog of cases that has to be processed in addition to and alongside the yearly incoming petitions, I believe is surmountable. And second, I believe that there's some very good proposals on the table. You've heard many now. In my view, drawn from reading the annual reports and speaking to some of the stakeholders over the past few months, the measures that were particularly successful over the 2017-2021 period were those that focused on systematization and streamlining of procedures so that there's less replication of effort, and making sure that specialized teams were in charge of particular types of cases and processes. But there's also very good proposals in terms of prioritization of structural cases, as mentioned by several of the candidates, a new case management system, and developing templates, for example, for recurrent themes. Each of these measures has pros and cons, and I believe the policy chosen should probably combine several of them. And again, this can be done within the budget and without changing the rules. The third consideration is that the reason behind the ongoing backlog hasn't been a lack of good ideas. It's been the lack of political will and consensus. In other words, this is as much a problem of will and politics as of technical case management. So once the commissioners, first of all, the commissioners have to come together and agree that this is a top priority, that over the next 4 years, the Commission can entirely work through the historical backlog. And once they decide on a set of proposals, or in deciding a set of proposals, the commissioners have to work with important stakeholders. So I strongly agree with the idea that there has to be spaces for dialogue over this problem so the Commission can reach common ground with the key stakeholders with whom, who share the burden of working through that historical backlog. The states and the victims and their representatives have to be on board with any solution to contend with the backlog. And here I want to speak to the concern voiced by civil society, for example, in the recent DPLF publication, that some of the progress being made may be at the expense of the integrity of the treatment of each case, and ultimately of the victims having due consideration of their particular case. The Commission needs to be very transparent in explaining how it is reaching the decisions to not process cases and reach them, and having those cases reach the merit stage. Throughout the process, commissioners have to prioritize victims and access to justice. Turning to the precautionary measures in my remaining 13 seconds, these of course are a key tool for the defense of human rights, and I will just say that I think there needs to be much greater transparency about how these are treated by.
Muchísimas gracias. Entonces pasamos al cuarto.
Thank you so much. So we move to the fourth block, which will be moderated by a different colleague. Thank you very much, Francisco. Dear candidates, now we go with questions from the audience. And 400 people have enrolled. And we have received 300 questions, of which we selected only 2, which are representative of the most recurrent topics that were found in the questions received. At the end of the event, we will send all candidates the complete list with the 300 questions. Each candidate may answer either of the 2 questions or both within a maximum time of 5 minutes. At this time, they can also include any final thoughts they wish to share with the audience. I remind you that the order of intervention is as follows: Alexandra Cuneos, Antonia Urrejola, Carlos Bernal, Roberta Clark, and Joel Hernandez. The 2 questions we have selected are: what recommendations do you have for strengthening the dialogue between the Commission and civil society? And the second question, and I will repeat them, what trait of your personality and of your trajectory makes you believe that you are the right candidate for this position? So we start with our first candidate. Alejandra, please. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Sorry, thank you very much. And so the first question, the Commission and civil society. I believe, first of all, I commend the Commission for how open it is and how dialogic it has been with civil society. I believe the Inter-American system outpaces its fellow international human rights bodies in this sense. I believe, though, that you can never have too much, and that the Commission needs to work proactively to have a broader set of interlocutors in civil society. For example, I believe that while there are very strong links with the countries that frequently come before the Inter-American system, and particularly the countries that are signatories to the American Convention and submitted to the jurisdiction of the court, there are many countries that have the civil societies have a much thinner relationship with the Inter-American system, and that it is up to the Commission to proactively seek out opportunities to have relationships and dialogues with those interlocutors. For example, I believe that in the Caribbean, there could be a much more fertile conversation with those on the ground working to promote the rights of different rights movements within the Caribbean. And I believe that the Commission could have a much more fluid interaction also with US and Canadian civil society organizations and public interest litigants. Let me turn to the question of my own personality and my own traits that I bring to this and that I think would make me a good commissioner. First of all, I am a leader in my own university and have dealt not only with human rights in my research and working with the Inter-American system, but I've also dealt with a bureaucracy, with internal leadership, organizational leadership, and that's a quality that I would bring to working alongside the Secretary of the Inter-American Commission. In particular, an emphasis of mine at the university has been fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization. And I believe that this is something that could translate very well and in an important way to the Commission. I believe that the Commission as an institution needs to be more diverse, everyone within the Commission needs to feel included and welcome. And this is an emphasis that I would bring. Second of all, I am bicultural and bilingual. I've traveled throughout the region, and I believe that I straddle knowledge of the Latin American legal systems as well as the Commonwealth and the Anglo-American common law systems, and that this is an important quality that I would bring to the table as a commissioner. Finally, I'd like to take my final 2 minutes to say a few things that I ran out of time on, if that's permissible. I just wanted to say, in terms of the precautionary measures, that many of the civil society actors that I've spoken to are concerned that since the strengthening process, the Commission is rejecting more measures and that they're processing them too slowly. And the problem that I ran into here is that there's little information. If you compare this to the question of the backlog, we don't have a lot of information from the Commissioner about individual trajectories of cases, and we don't have a lot of studies from scholarly communities, in part, I believe, because the information is lacking. And so I believe that a first measure in dealing with precautionary measures would be to create greater transparency so that we can have a more robust understanding and response of the problems that they face. And more deeply, I believe it's important to have a vision of what the measures do. Some of those I've spoken to are concerned. The system of asking states what institutions they have are available is paramount to asking for an exhaustion of resources requirement. At the same time, it seems important to work with states to craft competent resources to these life-threatening situations at the national level. So I believe that it's very important to think about what is the impact of the system on states and how it can push states to create a more agile response to those moments when human rights are imperiled. To think of the system as potentially a type of proactive complementarity. In closing, I do want to thank the organizers, CEJIL, Redlad, Konrad Adenauer, the Robert Kennedy Human Rights, IFEX-ALC, and Open Society for having us and for the work that you do in creating.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Ahora le paso la palabra a la doctora.
Now, I give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you so much. And I'll start talking about the civil society aspects as I did in my first intervention. I think the Commission must continue to undertake constant efforts so that the connection with civil society is fluid. That's extremely important because it contributes to strengthening the system. I also think that the territorial organizations that have no experience with the system have to be involved. We saw that with the pandemic, with the NGOs, we had to try to come to the basis, and the indigenous organizations and the rapporteur of indigenous peoples could establish a direct relationship with the indigenous peoples themselves, in addition to civil society organizations. Additionally, we should also try to strengthen the relationship with civil society. That's very important. Social forums, meetings, so that we can go back to the territories and also to the more remote territories that we are unable to get to, but they need the Commission to reach them. And as I always like to reiterate, the Commission should continue to strengthen the dialogue with the victims. These forums are essential in themselves. They are a recovery effort. And in line with what was said about the societies of the United States and Canada, there's a lot to be done. And why I think I would be a good candidate for re-election? Well, because I have experience as a human rights attorney from the perspective of the state. So I'm familiar with the obstacles and the creation of public policies, structural obstacles, internal obstacles, the difficulty of combining agendas. I know what it is like to be on the other side. I know the OAS general law. I worked there, and I'm also experienced in the academia. So I have experience across different platforms, always focusing on human rights, but across different platforms. And in my opinion, that is a benefit that I can bring to the Commission, technical knowledge, in addition to my political capacity to establish a dialogue, which is something required by the political times ahead of us. I also have empathy to work with human rights, which is fundamental, to place yourself in somebody else's shoes, especially when they're victims, and always according to the mandate of the Commission and strengthening dialogue, searching for agendas in common and consensus whenever possible. And as I said before, Candidate Hernandez heard me. I did not, I don't know if he heard it, but I did not insist on this idea of adversaries. I always try to establish a dialogue, and I believe in the need for permanent forums for a dialogue, and we have to search for common agendas. We also have the role of looking for meeting spaces to work in coordination. Without technical cooperation, the system does not work. The commission must be harsh when necessary, and at the same time, it should try to establish a permanent contact with the states through technical cooperation and dialogue. And once again, I'd like to reemphasize the importance of dialogue, not only with the executive, but also with the legal bodies, with the legislative. All that is fundamental, especially if we consider what we have ahead of us and what we have to face, and always based on, always with a focus on the victims. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Urrejola. I would like to, I stand corrected. I said that we had received 300 questions, but it's actually not that many. We actually received 60 questions. I hope that's good news. It's easier to answer in a timely manner. And well, with that, I'd like to remind you that the first question is, which recommendations would you make to strengthen a discussion between the IACHR and the civil society? And the second question is, what's your personality trait that would be beneficial for you in occupying this position? Thank you very much for such interesting questions. About question number one, I wish to say that the commission has to keep every door open for dialogue and cooperation across all levels of civil society, both at the territory, national and regional level. That's very important when we think about the role that I propose to IACHR as a leader, and not only in this bilateral relationship. I agree with this idea that seems essential to me for the democratic constitutionalism, which is a public criticism in constitutional democracy. What's important is a deliberation based on the best argument, and the best argument relates to what are human rights, what are the standards to be followed, and how to best implement these standards. So that is the vision that the civil society organizations should bring into our discussion. And another important factor are evidences. The IACHR has to decide based on evidence, and the civil society organizations have a fundamental role when they incorporate the commission to the procedures with which the commissioners must make their decisions. And I would say that there are many strategic possibilities here. Some of them are sophisticated strategies with the use of technologies that are not that expensive, or even strategies involving in-person visits and cross-territory, cross-region dialogues that allow for this interaction. About the second question, well, I can say that there are basically three personality traits that would make me a good commissioner. For one, I'm independent. That is, I have not worked in politics with any state, and neither have I belonged to any civil society organization. So I have a critical thinking, and I work on being at peace with my own conscience. And I believe that this could strengthen the legitimacy of an organization such as IACHR. something that surprised me in the questions with the ambassadors is that the majority of the ambassadors from the left and right wings coincide in terms of the lack of legitimacy of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I believe that the only way for us to challenge this lack of legitimacy is through independent commissioners from states and civil society that may decide based on a law and on the creation of better public policies, in addition to being based on the evidences of each proceedings. The second trait of my personality is transparency. I believe in what was said by an important scholar, and that applies to judges, but should also be applied to commissioners, which is that the society has the right to know the ideology of its judges and commissioners. And I always advocate for this transparency. My ideology is in my work, and that can be assessed, and I'm consistent with this ideology. And lastly, I am a person who believes in dialogue and conciliation. I have critical thinking, and I always try to look for better solutions or how to improve what already exists. And I know that it is through collaboration and dialogue and discussion that we're able to reach a consensus. That is a strength. On the one hand, you can have a critical thinking, and on the other, you can be a conciliator. And these are two strengths, two strong aspects. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Dr. Roberta Clark.
Thank you very much. Whilst I appreciate the doctorate, it won't be accurate. So just to set that record straight. Starting with the first question about the role of NGOs in civil society. As I said, as I began the very first question, participation, I think, is the precondition for the effective functioning of the Commission, and that participation of people across our region, people through their member states, but people through the voices of the NGOs that represent especially those who are most dispossessed. So I think that participation is a precondition to the effectiveness of the Commission. NGOs are the voice of the dispossessed. They monitor the state. They raise the alarms on crises, incoming crises. They exercise leadership, and they often function in situations of hardship and situations of risk and threat. And so we really do have to be really attentive to the NGO movement and to civil society. Act as human rights defenders, I think, is at the heart of the work of the Commission. But we have to also find ways, and I think the Commission has been doing that, has an enviable history of doing that, but we have to find ways to ensure diversity of engagement of NGOs. When I say a diversity, I think a diversity within countries as well as between countries. When we think of the digital platform, we also have to be thinking again of that digital divide. Many NGOs in remote rural districts, NGOs in urban underserved communities may not have access to the internet, to Wi-Fi. Certainly we know that in the case of some countries in the Caribbean, over 50% of their populations may not have access to Wi-Fi. So we have to be thinking NGOs across that kind of digital divide and have different strategies for ensuring the voices of a diversity of NGOs. And certainly in relation to the Caribbean, there has to be a much more routine engagement with Caribbean NGOs. I have to say, I'm looking at the organizers of this event, and thank you very much for organizing it, but I don't necessarily see any NGOs from the Caribbean as a co-organizer. So this inclusion of NGOs, this very intentional inclusion of NGOs from the Caribbean, I think is also an outstanding work for the regional NGO movement as well. And I think in relation to the ensuring the diversity of voices, we want to be also ensuring that NGOs have access to the capacity development that the Commission puts on from time to time, its workshops, the diversity of NGOs to share their perspective on what is happening in the country, and as an information source. So for many reasons. in relation to what I bring as to the commission, well, I started with saying I'm an attorney at law, but really what I am is a feminist, social justice, gender equality advocate. This is what I've been for all of my adult years. I have expressed that work in the NGO movement. I have a very strong NGO background. I'm actually now working in the NGO background or contributing to NGOs. But for quite many number of years, I worked within the multilateral system of the UN and engaged very practically with member states in dialogue, giving technical advisory services to problem solve. So I think I actually have a demonstrated history of working with states and carrying the voices of NGOs and working with states to solve some of the problems. In relation to my personality traits, like Carlos, I am independent. I have not been associated or employed by, I should say, I have not been employed by government in my working life. But I also I'm analytical. I have a multidisciplinary background, and I think that sociology and law is really important from the work of the commission. So much of what the commission does is at the nexus of socio-legal or legal political analysis, and I can bring that multidisciplinary background to the work of the commission, and my analytical and curious mind. So some of personality traits, I'm also quite curious about the world and about people, and I think you have to be curious in the commission to listen carefully to the range of voices that give you a more or less complete picture of what people are facing when they are confronting violations of human rights. I would say, finally, and I think it's really important, I'm joyful. And I think when you work hard, as the commission does, the secretariat is working hard, you have to do that with a spirit of optimism and joyfulness and thinking that you can make change and working hard to make change. I think that's really important to also have a non-hierarchical way of working amongst ourselves with utmost respect for each other's strengths and voices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Ahora le doy la palabra al Dr. Joel Hernández.
Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Dr. Joel Hernández. About the first question, I'd like to say that once again, it's important to build on the existing base that has been built over the last 4 years. And that is how the Commission operates more closely to the civil society. And that has to be done with the coalition of civil society organizations. But I also think that these 2 years of virtual work, they have taught us lots of lessons, and that's what we have to do to work with civil society more closely. The pandemic made it clear that there are technological and technical tools to establish a conversation with organizations from across the hemisphere without requiring people to travel to the headquarters or to the commission for their sessions. And I think that it is important to continue to work through these virtual means, even after the pandemic. And secondly, I also think that we could observe the importance of working more closely with the base organizations, the organizations that are in the territories and which have very specific concerns that have to be catered to in a very specific way. And the third thought is connected with the higher amount of regional audiences that the Commission has during its sessions, both in the previous report related to the people deprived of freedom and the human rights. These regional hearings with civil society have brought about extremely valuable contributions. And now I'll skip to question number 2. Before talking about my personality traits, I'd just like to dedicate a few seconds to talk about the traits that the commissioners of the Inter-American Commission must have. For one, I would say that they have to maintain the plurality, diversity of its members. We know that we all are nourished by the professional experiences of our fellows from the academia or from the private sector, and also others that come from different positions working with the government. We have to become stronger with each other and have a more complete mission as well. And secondly, I think it's fundamental for the Commission to maintain gender equity. Currently, we have 5 female and 2 male commissioners. When I got here, it was 4 and 3. So I think that over the last 4 years, the promotion of women's rights is responsible, that is not only of women, but also of men. How could it contribute to the Commission? Well, I'd say through 3 different things. For one, a deep knowledge about the functioning of international organisms, especially IACHR. I know the deep aspects, the deepest aspects of the Commission. And I also want to mention a very important situation. We're facing a crisis of multilateralism, and our biggest challenge is to maintain the human rights organisms at work and keep them effective, functional, and legitimate. Secondly, I wish to talk about my capacity to create consensus. Over the course of my education as a Mexican diplomat for 25 years, my professional background, I worked with crises, always trying to reach a consensus, and this is what I bring to the table in several different moments, including to strengthen in the strengthening process. And lastly, the capacity to establish a dialogue both with the civil society organizations and the states. I worked building bridges and agreements, never assuming this position of an opponent. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the candidates for their participation and their responses. It's been a very important dialogue that complements with excellence their presentations before the Permanent Council of the OAS and strengthens the exchange of information with the civil society. I remind you that this event has been recorded and will be available to everyone. Finally, I would like you to follow the event with the candidates for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which will take place next Wednesday, October the 13th at 2 p.m. in Lima and 3 p.m. in Washington, D.C., 4 p.m. in Buenos Aires. You can access the registration for the event with the candidates for the court on our social networks. And with that, I'd like to wrap up our session.